This is LSAT Prep Test 144, Section 1, Passage 3 about Haudenosaunee Wampum. Most people think wampum is money. This passage says that's wrong. Fairly low to medium difficulty passage because it's got a pretty straightforward structure, but there is a trap that gets a lot of students. Now, this is a humanities passage. The author is correcting a misunderstanding. The main point is that wampum wasn't currency, it was a political communication tool that evolved over centuries from religious objects into something like a legal system. Now, the most important part here is the middle of paragraph 1. You're going to hit the word however. Everything before it is the view the author is about to reject. Everything after it is the real argument. If you blow past that word however, you're going to misread the entire passage. So paragraph 1 opens with the Haudenosaunee developing a communication system using wampum before Europeans showed up. Then the author brings in the common take. Most historians say wampum was primarily money. And the author does something sneaky here. There is a concession. The passage says wampum certainly did become a medium of exchange. That might sound like agreement, but it's not, because you want to read the next part closely. That only happened because Europeans misunderstood wampum and used it to buy goods. The Europeans got it wrong, and historians followed their lead. After the word however, that's when you get the author's real position. Wampum's true significance is its evolution from religious objects into a tool for maintaining peace between nations. And this is the thesis. Read paragraph 1 slowly because it's doing the most important work in the passage. Paragraph 2 backs up in time. It explains what wampum looked like in the very beginning. It was loose beads in 2 colors, white and deep purple. Each color had a spiritual meaning. White connected to a spirit called sapling, who created good things like trees. Purple connected to sapling's twin brother Flint, who caused storms and trouble. The passage gives you stories about these spirits and about anglers throwing beads into water. You don't want to get bogged in these details, they're just examples. Their job is to prove one thing. Even in its simplest form, wampum carried meaning. It was never just decoration or currency. Then, right at the end of paragraph 2, loose beads get strung together. Now you've got string wampum, and string wampum gets used for simple political messages, things like truce requests. And that shift from loose beads to strings is the first step in the evolution the author is tracking. Notice the pattern here. Religious meaning first, then political use grows out of it. Paragraph 3 is where the evolution finishes. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy forms around 1451. That is the political event that pushes wampum into a full-blown communication system. Wampum belts get created to encode the Confederacy's constitution. These belts created string wampum into icons that trained people could read. And the passage gives you a bunch of examples here. Longhouses meant a specific nation, diamond outlines might mean council fires, lines between figures showed the state of relations between peoples. The point here isn't any single symbol. You could move through any of these examples quickly. The point is that this was a designed system for recording and sharing political information. The belts were public documents. They stored law. They served as safe conduct passes. They made the Confederacy's rules available to everyone. Then the last couple of sentences close it out. The wampum system had a limited number of symbols, but it still worked well enough to frame and enforce law for hundreds of years. That is the author's final move, showing that this wasn't some primitive workaround, it was effective. Now, the key move here is the correction in paragraph 1. The author takes the common view, wampum equals money, and replaces it with a totally different story. Every paragraph after that pivot is evidence for the replacement. Paragraph 2 proves wampum had meaning from the start. Paragraph 3 proves it became a sophisticated political tool. The passage runs on an evolution chain. Religious objects become simple political tools, which become a full symbolic system. If you see that chain, the passage snaps into place. Now, the author thinks wampum's real significance is political and communicative. The Europeans misread it, and historians repeated the mistake. Now, here is where students go wrong. They read that concession that it certainly did become a medium of exchange and think the author is agreeing wampum was money. But the author is not agreeing. That line exists to say, yes, this happened, but only because outsiders didn't understand what wampum actually was. If you treat that concession as the author's own view, you're going to miss the main point in author's attitude questions. Now, before you go on to the questions, check yourself on three things. First, why does the author mention the Europeans at all? Second, what is the difference between what the loose beads did and what the wampum belts did? And third, why is the formation of the Confederacy the turning point in the author's argument? That was passage 3. Now we're going to go on to passage 4 in PrepTest 144, section 1. Just getting set up for that. This is LSAT PrepTest 144, section 1, passage 4. This is a comparative or dual passage. The topic is Karl Popper and whether negative evidence in science is as powerful as he claims. Medium difficulty passage. The ideas are pretty straightforward, but students consistently misread the relationship between these two passages. Now, both passages are on the same team. That is the thing you've got to lock in before anything else. Passage A makes a philosophical argument. Passage B supplies the proof. They are not debating each other. They are not offering different angles. B is A's backup. If you walk into the questions thinking these passages disagree even slightly, you're cooked. Now, passage A, paragraph 1. This gives you Popper's position. Black swan, white swan. You've probably seen this example before. One counterexample kills a theory. Fine, that part is just logic. But then Popper cranks it up. He says positive evidence has zero value. Negative evidence is basically the whole game. And a theory only counts as scientific if it can be tested this way. Now, you want to read this paragraph at a normal speed. You need Popper's view, but you don't need to memorize all the details. Paragraph 2 is where passage A actually matters. You want to slow down here. The author says Popper's clean logic doesn't match how science really works. And the reason is one word: auxiliary. Theories don't make predictions by themselves. They travel with a whole crew of background assumptions, like other theories, equipment working right, no interference, and so when a prediction fails, you're staring at a lineup of suspects. The theory might be guilty, but so might any other of these extra assumptions. You can't just point at the theory and say it's dead. Now, that last line of paragraph 2 is the thesis of the entire passage set. Positive evidence is never final, but negative evidence usually isn't either. If you remember one sentence from passage A, that's the one. Now, passage B, no argument there, just two stories, but the order matters. Story 1, Uranus. Scientists use Newton's laws plus a stack of assumptions to predict its orbit. The prediction is wrong, and so they have a choice. Blame Newton or blame the assumptions. They blame the assumptions. They say there must be a hidden planet throwing things off. And then Neptune shows up right where it should be. Victory. The assumptions were the problem and Newton survives. Story 2, Mercury, exact same setup. Newton's laws, assumptions, wrong prediction. And scientists try the same fix. They invent a planet called Vulcan to explain the error, but Vulcan never shows up. Eventually, Einstein's theory comes along and nails Mercury's orbit using the same old assumptions. And so this time, Newton's laws actually were the problem. Now here is why passage B needs both stories and not just one. The Uranus case alone would make it look like blaming assumptions always works. The Mercury case shows it sometimes fails spectacularly. Put them together, and you get exactly what passage A argued. When a prediction goes wrong, there is no formula for predicting which piece broke. Scientists guessed right with Uranus, they guessed wrong with Mercury, same method, opposite results. Now, that pairing is the key move for this entire passage set. The test writers are going to build their hardest questions around it. Now, here is the trap. Students read passage B as a neutral history lesson. Two fun stories about planets. But every detail is chosen to demonstrate passage A's point. The Uranus discovery isn't there because it's interesting, it's there because it shows auxiliary assumptions can be the real culprit. The Mercury failure isn't there for drama, it's there to show that sometimes the main theory is guilty after all. Passage B is doing argumentative work disguised as storytelling. Now, here's one more thing you want to watch. Passage B never mentions Popper by name. It never says, and this is why Popper was wrong. The link between the two passages is totally implicit. The test expects you to build the connection by yourself. So if a question asks what the author of passage B would say about Popper's view, you've got to reason through it. Passage B's examples show that negative evidence is ambiguous. Popper says negative evidence is decisive, and so the authors of passage B would disagree with Popper. But you won't find a passage or sentence that says so directly. Now, the author's stance across both passages is that negative evidence looks clean on paper, but is messy in practice. You can never be sure which part of your reasoning was the broken part. And so Popper's mistake is treating a logical point as if it settles a practical question. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to check yourself on three things. First, can you explain why auxiliary premises make Popper's position fall apart? Second, why does passage B need both the Uranus and the Mercury examples to make its point? And third, if a question asks where the two authors agree, can you state their shared conclusion in one sentence without looking back at the passage? So that was test 144. We're going to go on now to 143. This is LSAT Prep Test 143, Section 2, Passage 1. This is a fight between anthropologists about whether video cameras destroy indigenous cultures or help them. It's a low difficulty passage. The structure is pretty straightforward, but there is one trap that catches a lot of students. Now, this is a social science passage. Two sides argue, the author picks one. The main point is that indigenous peoples can use Western video technology on their own cultural terms. Now, the most important paragraph is paragraph 4. That's where the debate stops being theoretical and actual evidence shows up. If you understand what paragraph 4 does, you'll get most of the questions right. Now, paragraph 1 is background. You want to skim it. Here's what it gives you. Indigenous peoples used to be filmed by Western anthropologists. Now they're filming themselves. And anthropologists cannot agree on whether that's good or bad. That phrase, sharply divided is your signal. A two-sided debate is coming. Once you register that, move on. Paragraph 2 is Wiener's argument, and it's the side the author is going to reject. Wiener thinks video is a weapon disguised as a tool. He says it carries a Western ontology. That just means a Western way of understanding reality. His claim is that the camera itself forces a Western worldview onto whoever uses it. So indigenous peoples lose their cultural identity in the act of trying to preserve it. And that's actually a pretty clever argument, sounds persuasive, but that's dangerous for you. If Wiener's logic sticks in your head, you're going to misread the author's position later. So read this paragraph to understand it, but tag it mentally as the side that loses. Then paragraph 3 is Ginsburg hitting back. She calls Wiener's argument, quote, boilerplate technological determinism. Sounds fancy, but basically it just means he's blaming the tool instead of looking at how people actually use it. She says non-Western peoples can pick up a camera without becoming Western. And then she goes further. She says video can actually protect indigenous languages and traditions. Now, you want to watch the top of this paragraph. Ginsburg concedes something. She admits no Western object has entered other cultures as a neutral thing. Students see that and think she's meeting Wiener halfway, but she's not. The concession is a throat-clearing move. She's acknowledging one small point so she can reject everything else. So don't soften your view of her position because of that. Now, paragraph 4 is where the passage wins the argument. You want to slow down here. This is Turner studying the Kayapo people in Brazil. The Kayapo are an oral society. They film two things, their ceremonies and their dealings with the Brazilian government. Now, the government filming is practical. It creates legal records. But the ceremony filming is the real evidence. Turner found that Kayapo videos follow Kayapo principles of beauty. The camera work, the editing, all of it mirrors the structure of the ceremonies themselves. The camera did not colonize their art. They made the camera serve their art. And that one finding demolishes Wiener's whole argument. And then notice what comes after it. Nothing, there is no counterpoint. There is no Some scholars remain unconvinced. The passage ends on Turner's evidence. That is the author telling you the debate is settled. Now, the key move here is the shift from opinion to proof. Paragraphs 2 and 3 are just people disagreeing. Paragraph 4 introduces fieldwork that actually resolves the disagreement. Now, the hardest questions on this passage will test whether you notice that shift. Now, the author sides with Ginsburg and Turner. Completely, there is no saying both sides have a point here, and that is exactly the trap. Wiener's argument is the most intellectually interesting part of this passage. It takes up an entire paragraph and uses big ideas, and students remember it. And so when they see a choice that says the author recognizes some validity in Wiener's concerns, it feels right, but it's actually wrong. The author thinks Wiener is wrong, and the Kayapo evidence is the proof. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to check yourself on these three things. First, what does Turner's research actually prove? Second, why does the author mention the Kayapo filming government transactions separately from ceremonies? And third, if someone asked you whose side this passage takes, could you point to the exact moment where you know? So that was passage 1. Next, passage 2. This is LSAT PrepTest 143, section 2, passage 2. It's about judicial recusal, when judges should step aside from a case. Medium difficulty passage. It reads smoothly, which is actually the danger here. The author's proposal is more radical than it sounds on a first read, and students consistently underestimate how far it goes. Now, this is a law passage making a direct argument. The author thinks the entire system for handling judicial bias is aimed at the wrong target. The main point is, stop trying to figure out whether a judge looks biased. Instead, make the judges show their legal reasoning in writing. Now, the most important paragraph is paragraph 3. That is where the proposal drops. Everything before it is tearing down the old system. Everything after it is cleaning up objections. Paragraph 3 is the whole ballgame. Now, paragraph 1 is background. You want to read it at a normal speed and not linger. It describes how recusal currently works. Judges are supposed to step aside when their impartiality could be reasonably questioned. Some jurisdictions let parties file for disqualification, others leave it entirely to the judge. None of this is the author's opinion. It's just the furniture in the room before the author rearranges it. Now, paragraph 2 is the attack. Now you're hearing the author's voice for the first time. There are 2 complaints here. First, the rules are vague. Might reasonably be questioned. Questioned by whom? From what angle? The rules don't say. Second, and this is the bigger one, the whole system chases the wrong thing. It focuses on how things look rather than whether bias actually exists. And then the author comes in right at the end of the paragraph. Focusing on appearances lets actual bias slide by unnoticed. Bias that even the judge might not recognize in themselves. You want to hold on to that. The author isn't saying appearances don't matter because they're superficial. The author is saying appearances are actively dangerous because they distract from the real problem. Now, paragraph 3 is the proposal. You want to slow down here a lot. The author starts with the principle that judges exist to settle disputes through sound legal reasoning. So if reasoning is the job, making judges prove they did the job is important. The fix here is eliminate disqualification motions altogether and replace them with a requirement that judges write out their reasoning. Now, you want to catch the detail near the end of this paragraph because it's pretty easy to blow past. The author says judges should not have to justify why they didn't recuse. They should have to justify the decision they actually reached. So the author moved the entire conversation here. It's not about asking, are you biased? It's about asking, can you show your work? And that is a fundamentally different system. Now, paragraph 4 is damage control, because the obvious objection shows up. What if a biased judge writes reasoning that sounds good? The author's answer to that is basically, so what? If the reasoning can hold up under scrutiny, if a knowledgeable observer can't poke a hole in it, then there was no harm done. And under the law, if there's no harm, there's no complaint. Now that's a pretty cold argument, right? Because the author is openly accepting that some hidden bias might survive under the new system. But the author's position is that undetectable bias producing legally sound outcomes is not a problem worth solving. So this paragraph here is not introducing any new ideas, it's just defending what you already heard. Now, the key move here is a full system replacement. The author doesn't fix the current approach. The author throws it out and builds something different in its place. They want out with appearances, in with transparent reasoning. And that swap, that distinction, is what the hardest questions will focus on. Now, the trap here is that students read this and come away thinking the author wants a better way to catch biased judges. But that's not true. The author actually wants to stop trying to catch biased judges entirely. The whole point is that hunting for bias is a dead end. So the replacement system is not detecting bias at all. It's checking the quality of the judge's reasoning. And if you miss that distinction, you're going to pick answers that sound reasonable, but describe a different argument than what the author's actually making. And that's going to burn you on the questions. Now, before you touch the questions, check yourself on these three things. First, what specifically does the author want to replace disqualification motions with? Second, why does the author think hidden bias is acceptable if the reasoning checks out? And third, why does the author consider the appearance-based approach not just insufficient, but actually counterproductive? So that was passage 2. Next, passage 3. This is LSAT PrepTest 143, section 2, passage 3. This is a comparative or dual passage set. The topic is whether it's morally okay to respond to wrongdoing with the same kind of wrongdoing. Medium difficulty set. The ideas are pretty straightforward, but they agree just enough to trick you into thinking they fully agree, and that's not true. Now, both of these are philosophy passages. Passage A is about lying to liars. Passage B is about punishing wrongdoers through a Kantian lens. Different examples, same underlying question. When someone does something wrong, does that give you permission to do it right back? Passage A, first paragraph, is pure setup. The author puts the eye for an eye position on display. They say, lying to a liar feels fair, restores a balance. It's like how bullies forfeit the right to not be bullied back. But don't mistake this for what the author actually thinks. This is the common view. The author's about to complicate, move through it at a normal pace. Second paragraph of passage A is the whole game. The author does something sneaky here. They split what seems like one question into two. Question 1, does a liar have the right to be told the truth? Question 2, is it actually okay to lie to them? You would think those are the same question, but the author's entire point is that they're not. And the pathological liar example is how they prove it. Everyone knows this person lies constantly, and so no, that person can't really complain if you lie to them. They gave up that right. But here's where the author turns the corner. Even though the liar can't complain, lying to them still does damage. It hurts you, it hurts other people, it erodes trust in a way that spills out beyond that one interaction. Now, you want to watch for those last few sentences, quote, the harm to self, others, and general trust. That is the author tipping their hand. Forfeiting your right does not erase the consequences. Now, passage B. First paragraph lays out a Kantian argument step by step. When a rational person acts immorally towards someone else, they are implicitly signing off on that same treatment coming back at them. It's not revenge, it's just logic. By choosing to act in a certain way, you have endorsed that behavior as acceptable. And so when it comes back around, you authorized it. You want to read this paragraph carefully here. Each sentence builds on the one that came before it. If you skim, the chain breaks, and the rest of the passage is not going to make sense. Now, the second paragraph of passage B. That is where most students get tripped up. The Kantian argument sounds like it's building toward a duty to punish. The author says no. It gives you a right, not a duty. And that distinction is everything. You are allowed to treat wrongdoers the way they treated others. Nobody's required to. The passage then closes with a tight logical chain. Rational beings can't object to being treated as they treated others. No valid objection means no injustice. No injustice means everybody acted within their rights. You want to slow way down for the ending because all LSAT loves that chain. They're going to test it in the questions. Now, here is the key move. Both passages start from the same basic premise. Wrongdoers open the door to being treated in kind. They agree on that much, but they land in completely different places. Passage A treats the issue as settled once the wrongdoer loses the right to complain. No complaint, no injustice, end of story. Passage A says, not so fast. Even when the wrongdoer can't complain, real harm still exists. The consequences ripple outward. So for passage A, the question stays open. For passage B, it's closed. And that split is what the hardest questions will test. The trap is picking answers that say these passages fully agree or fully disagree. They do neither. They share a starting point and then walk in completely different directions. There is also a second trap. Students read these as being about completely different topics, one about lying, one about punishment. But if you stay on the surface here, the relationship questions will eat you alive. You've got to see past the examples to the shared question underneath. There's also one more thing worth noticing. Both authors use the same basic method. They take a general principle, follow its logic carefully, and then land on a conclusion that is more limited than you'd expect. Passage A narrows the eye for an eye view by showing it ignores broader harm. Passage B narrows the Kantian argument by saying it produces a right, not a duty. So both authors are pulling back from the obvious conclusion. And that parallel matters for any question about how the passages are alike in their reasoning. Now, before you hit the questions, make sure you're clear on these three things. First, what are the two moral questions passage A separates, and why does the author bother separating them? Second, in passage B, what is the actual difference between a right and a duty, and why does the author insist on it? And third, most importantly, at what exact point do these two passages stop traveling together? So that was passage 3. Now we're going to cover passage 4. This is LSAT PrepTest 143, section 2, passage 4. This is a science passage about whether glass in old windows slowly flows downward over time. On the initial read, the difficulty is not too bad, but you don't want to be careless here. The passage does one thing: it kills a myth. People believe old cathedral windows are thicker at the bottom because glass flows like a very slow liquid. The passage says that's nonsense and then tells you what's actually going on. Now, there is no mystery here about where the author stands. You're going to know by the end of paragraph 1. So your job here is to track the structure so you don't get sloppy on the questions. Paragraph 1 gives you the myth and explains why it exists. Glass does not have a neat crystal structure. Its atoms look disorganized, kind of like a liquid. And that similarity is where the confusion comes from. But the passage draws a clear line. Below something called the glass transition temperature, basically a range where a molten glass cools into a solid, glass behaves like a solid. And notice the word myth there. The author is not building to a reveal. The verdict is in before paragraph 1 is over. Paragraph 2 is the heart of the passage. This is where you slow down. A researcher named Zanato calculated how long it would take for cathedral glass to flow enough that you'd actually notice. The answer is longer than the age of the universe. You want to lock in the relationship here between Zanato's calculations and the conclusion. His math is the evidence, the myth being wrong is the claim. The LSAT loves asking you to distinguish between these things. Then paragraph 3 keeps stacking evidence. It brings up germanium oxide glass, which flows more easily than other types. Even that would take trillions of years. Then it acknowledges that medieval glass has impurities that could speed things up. But speeding things up relative to trillions of years still doesn't get you anywhere near hundreds of years. So you can pick up your pace here, nothing new is happening. Every detail in this paragraph is just reinforcing what paragraph 2 already proved. Now, one thing to flag. That last sentence about needing 350 degrees Celsius for glass to flow is not a new argument. It's a different way of showing the same point. Don't treat it like it's a separate claim. Then paragraph 4 flips the question. So if glass doesn't flow, why are old windows actually thicker at the bottom? And the answer is, it's because that's how people made glass before the 19th century. They blew molten glass into a globe, flattened it into a disc, and the spinning made the edges thicker. Then whoever installed it probably put the thick side down. The heavy side down, that's it. The rest of the paragraph is a quick history of how glass making got better over time. You could skim that. The only thing that matters here is the alternative explanation itself. If the question's asked what paragraph 4 does, the answer is it replaces the debunked myth with the real cause. Now here's the key move. The myth sounds perfectly reasonable. Glass looks like a liquid at the atomic level. Old windows really are thicker at the bottom. Everything lines up until you do the math, and the math destroys it. That gap between sounds right and this is physically impossible is where they ask the trickiest questions. Now, the author is not cautious here, not even a little. This is not the evidence suggests territory. The debunking is absolute. So if you see a choice that softens the author's position, words like suggests, raises doubts, or questions the validity. That is the trap. The author is not questioning anything. The author is saying the myth is flat out wrong. Now, before you go on to the questions, check yourself on 3 things. First, why does the passage bring up germanium oxide glass? Second, what is the actual reason old windows are thicker at the bottom? And third, what role do Zanotto's calculations play in the argument? Are they the conclusion or are they the support? By the way, folks, if you're looking for support with your LSAT prep, I'm offering free LSAT tutoring for anybody watching this now or later. The link to book that free tutoring with me is at unpluggedprep.com/start. The link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and IG as well. This is an additional live stream covering actual LSAT reading count passages, in addition to the regular daily live Q&As I do at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific. I'll be back tomorrow. In the meantime, all the best. Take care. Thanks for joining.